Good morning and welcome, beloveds. Once again, we cross the threshold of time to virtually join together for this Sabbath hour, a time apart from the world's anxiety, from the political tumult and turbulence, a brief respite from the stresses, strains, and joys for those of us juggling home, work, schooling, and family relations that we seek to manage daily. The gremlin has just entered my computer. We grieve together the COVID deaths of nearly 2 million people worldwide. And we place on our altar of worship those losses and accomplishments, sorrows and joys, particular to our individual lives. Let us breathe ourselves back into connection as Olga offers music to soothe, and we settle ourselves into the light of love and peace. Thank you, Olga, for that beautiful, soothing music as we settle into being together. I am Reverend Abigail Stockman, and I am honored to be serving as your sabbatical minister for worship while Reverend Linda Sutherland and you have a sabbatical away from one another. She will be returning to her congregational duties on April 1st, no fooling. And I know that you will all look forward to that day. One small caveat, I live in a home with 2 dogs and I never know when barking will break out. So my apologies if there is suddenly a loud, unexpected noise. We come together to restore our resolve, deepen our courage, and strengthen our hearts for the work of living lives grounded in the truth as best we can discern it, of a love larger than our understanding and wide enough for all beings to enter, a love that shines light into the shadows. The light of our chalice this morning will be lit by Bob McDonald. And if you have a chalice or a candle with you in your space, take this moment to light it as Bob lights one for us all.
Yes. Our light is the light of the sun, keeper of all we love. Our light is the light of the earth, provider of sustenance. Our light is the light of all living things, life precious like our own. Our light is the light of each of us, bound together in need and hope. Our light is the light of the cosmos, keeper of all we know.
The light of all living things, the light of the cosmos. The images for these categories of light, all living things and the cosmos are so much larger than I am able to briefly bring to my mind's eye. So I imagine, as I think about it, I imagine that as so many different living things as I can put into my mind's eye in just a few seconds. For the light of each of us, my imagination begins with you, who I have looked at before as we gather. And then perhaps the faces of some of you who I've seen in the last 2 weeks, but are not here today. And then I might imagine all the Unitarian Universalists who gather at this hour, and all the people who gather at varied hours and days in churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, and other sacred indoor and outdoor spaces around the world. And then I might imagine all the people who live near oceans and seas, and all the people who live in the mountains and valleys, and all the people who feel sad or joyous at various moments, and who yearn for justice and for love. All 7.8 billion, though I can't really imagine that, other humans on this planet. Perhaps you may even be able to envision images of the cosmos and the life beyond our Earth. As we have lit our chalice, we have done so with these inclusive images. In conceiving a wide doorway to truth, let us imagine with mind and heart that if there are enduring truths in the past, present, and future of all existence, that those truths hold for all. Nobody gets left out. Nobody gets left behind. Please note that on the slides for our anthem today, there is a small error. The music we are about to hear was composed by Brian Tate, but the multiple voices and piano accompaniment are the work of our brilliant musician, Olga Roga.
Nobody, nobody, no, nobody, 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 nobody gets left behind. Nobody, nobody, no, nobody, 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 nobody gets left behind. Come sisters and brothers, come fathers and mothers, we marching together. Nobody gets left behind. Come black ones and come black ones and white ones and solid and united together. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody, nobody, no, nobody, 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 nobody. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody, nobody, no, nobody, 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 nobody gets left behind. Come big ones and small ones, come short ones and tall ones, we marching together. Nobody gets left behind. Come old ones and new ones, LGBTQ ones, united together. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody, nobody, no, nobody, 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 nobody gets left behind. Nobody, nobody, no, nobody, 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 nobody gets, nobody, nobody gets, no, 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 nobody gets, no, nobody gets left behind.
That was so beautiful. Thank you, Olga and Pam, for the slideshow. Our story today is The Mouse and the Light by Lisa Suhay, and it is dedicated to the children of the world who have seen the shadow. With this story, you are given the power of the light. Go out and shine. In the center of the most beautiful garden in the world stood the tree of wisdom. From this great tree, there grew many branches and leaves. It spread its roots throughout the land. The tree was a place of comfort. Creatures would often come to it and sit in its shade and feel its great truths. For many years, there was harmony. Then, one day, a shade from one long branch decided that it was not happy. The shade did not wish to give comfort or shelter. "Fools," cried the shade as it spread beneath the tree. "I know more than any of them. I am not made to serve. I should rule over everything." And so it was that in pride and hatred, the shade tugged and pulled and stretched itself until at last it was able to break its attachment to the great tree. It became the first shadow. Instead of using its power to give shade, it created a cold darkness that blinded all those who touched it to the truth. Instead of using its voice to impart great truths to those around it, the shadow whispered only lies. The shadow crept away from the tree of wisdom and drifted far into a barren place where it crawled into a hole in the sand. It sank deep into the earth. The shadow grew and plodded. It would wait beneath the surface until a sad or doubting creature came near. Then the shadow would rise up and overtake the unsuspecting creature and blind it to the truth and bend it to its will. Over many years and many miles, the shadow created an underground army. Then the army of the shadow began to strike without warning, bringing fear, sadness, and hate to innocent creatures. You cannot fight. I will win, it lied. Some began to hide and fear the very light of day, for they thought that was the cause of the shadow. Others began to hate and fear all the shade of the world, not being able to tell the difference between shade and shadow. It came to pass that creatures began to feel anger toward all things different from themselves. They even became afraid of their own shadows. They stayed in their homes, and when they went out, they didn't go far. One day, a field mouse went to the tree of wisdom, shook its small fist, and shouted, How could you create such a terror upon us? Why is this allowed to continue?" The great tree bowed its huge trunk. It shook, and leaves fell like tears, but it did not answer. Then a voice spoke from all around. "I created light and darkness. I made creatures great and small. To one and all, I gave the power to build or destroy, bring joy or pain. One among you has chosen darkness and pain. This is not my wish." Though dazzled by being in the presence of this great power, the mouse was still angry. "Why don't you stop the shadow?" cried the mouse. "Because I have given that power to those the shadow harms. The shadow has grown through the lack of caring in creatures. Now, it is your job to stop it," the great voice answered. The voice told the mouse how to win. You cannot live in fear. Fear only makes the shadow grow. To be rid of darkness, shine. A powerful light of truth. To be rid of cold, bring only warmth wherever you go. The mouse answered, "I will go out and tell the others what you taught me. I will remember not to hate, because hate makes the shadow stronger." But Mouse worried. I am only one small being, and the shadows are now many. How can I ever hope to succeed?" Suddenly, the mouse was surrounded in a beautiful golden light and warmth. You know that as the shadow began to grow with one small, dark being, now the light will grow with you. So it was that one tiny creature set out into the world. With every kind word and every truth it spoke, the world grew around it healed. Others joined the mouse, and soon the light grew and the shadows faded. One by one, the shadow's followers fell before the mouse and the light. The shadow sank back into its hole in the earth, vanishing like drops of water in the burning sands of time. This little light, let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine. Here our story ends. Here our story begins.
Thank you, Deborah, for that lovely story. In fact, that could be our sermon today. But alas, there are so many ways that we manage to separate ourselves over and over from the one enduring tree of wisdom posited in this story. Though there may be multiple trees of wisdom, for I can imagine that each of us is a tree of wisdom about our own deepest selves, if we but allowed ourselves. And that our congregations could be at their core a tree of wisdom about their own being and project in this world. And that there might be the overarching, enduring trees of wisdom, like the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, that have always been available to us humans as shade and sustenance and truth. Here we are, collaborators in this marvelous, spectacular project of life. And yet, it seems that not all aspects of this marvelous, spectacular project are aligned with the beauty, wisdom, and truth of the light of love to which we dedicated our chalice today, to which we may dedicate ourselves as Unitarian Universalists. In these times, the urge to separate ourselves is strong in the face of our many cultural, political, and religious differences. And excuse me a moment. We make enduring truths often out of our current opinions or culturally grounded ideals. This often makes us vulnerable to the very acts of separating ourselves from those whose beliefs reflect what we see as the shadow of deep fear and shame and impotence that often manifests as greed and selfishness. In speaking of enduring spiritual truths, Father Richard Rohr, a contemporary contemplative Franciscan theologian who began the Center for Action and Contemplation, and he writes this about truth. Big truth is written in reality itself before it was ever written in books. If you say yes to reality, to what is, you will recognize the same truth when it shows itself in anyone's sacred scriptures. If it is the truth, it is true all the time and everywhere. And sincere lovers of the truth, he concludes, will take it from wherever it comes. We look around ourselves these days and perhaps wonder, how is it that some people who have such a different, scary, threatening to us perspective cannot see this capital R reality when it is so obvious to us? We wonder how it is that so many seemingly smart, educated people are unable to reason their way to our political worldview truths. We are frightened, uncertain, and therefore defensive. We are justifiably anxious for tomorrow and for our future. Many of us cannot understand how it is that the branch that fell off the tree and hid and became the shadow could gain such a strong following among real living human beings. Can they not see the light, the goodness of the larger tree and recognize the lies? And yet we also know it's human to live our lives cushioned by the by the belief in the certainty of our own rightness. Even as we can often acknowledge that our own efforts to live the truth often fall far short of their ideal. Ours is a faith tradition that calls us to imagine beloved community with ideals like those stated in our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, or the hope of our second principle that we will enact justice, equity, and compassion in all human relations. I added the all. We feel lost in the face of individuals and groups who do not seem to hold these principles as sacred as we do. We may feel unprepared and genuinely unaware that others, especially whole groups of people, do not take seriously our political democracy and the messy, complex work of compromise it takes to keep it working. Because for us Unitarian Universalisms, democracy is not simply a form of governance. It is a spiritual practice. The shadow in this story behaves in direct contrast to those principles, as do all real shadows of that kind. And yet we also know this truth spoken by the voice from all around. To one and all I gave the power to build or destroy, bring joy or pain. The loftiness of our principles and ideals has not, as we know, kept us from separating ourselves from others, neither individually nor as a religious tradition. Our theological and our organizational roots are deeply embedded in the European Protestant white religious traditions, not to mention heterosexual, cisgendered, able, and young-bodied history. We live today with the ongoing effects of a culture of white supremacy, which includes our Unitarian and Universalist, yes, this is true, history as colonizers of this land, forcibly taken from those who were already living here with their own rich culture and heritage. Today, among Unitarian Universalists and among many religious traditions, we are beginning the often discomforting work within ourselves, among and between one another, to face into the consequences of this white supremacy culture. We are learning about it by shining a light on our own shadow. We do this because we are recognizing how a narrow doorway withers our lofty ideals. We glimpse the power and the possibility. We see in the revelation of our shadow how we might widen the doorway and live more authentically into our principles of welcome, openness, and wholeness in this human world. In so doing, we move closer to becoming the beloved community where nobody gets left behind. Don't you just want to dance to that? In the Bible, biblical stories provided us with prophets to show us our shadows, like the bullfrog Jeremiah and the changing, constant, enduring Isaiah. Gautama Siddhartha was the prophet of the ways of Buddhism and Confucius of the ways of the Tao. And sometimes we humans recognize the prophets of our own time. Prophets are those who have the courage, the strengths, and the gifts to speak out against our collective blindness, to point out our shadows, to show us how we've placed our loyalties not with the tree of wisdom, but followed unwittingly perhaps a fallen branch into the shadows. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was certainly one of those prophets. Another prophet, perhaps a lesser prophet, as one of my seminary professors named some biblical prophets, one that Martin Luther King Jr. himself quoted, comes from over a century before, the early mid 1800s, the Unitarian James Russell Lowell. Both Lowell and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. addressed the ways in which our political democracy was falling so far short of its ideals. Each believed that our political democracy could do better in matching its actions to its ideals. Each held up the light of awareness to show the shadows of separation to which we either blinded ourselves or simply allowed ourselves silent complicity. They shined the light on how these separations reaped traumatic consequences upon the people who suffered from being cast aside or set at the margins of being considered barely human. And the spiritual consequences they pointed to and shone the light on for those of us complicit in those marginalizations. Tomorrow, we will celebrate the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a prophet and a hero who stood up with a bright light into the darkness of white supremacy culture, not only as it pertained to individuals and to race, but also how it was applied to value different kinds of labor as more or less worthy. We all know that this struggle not only continues today, but we have seen that it can become violent, as it did on January 6th. James Russell Lowell spoke his truth to power regarding our democracy in the 1840s when he wrote in response to the present crisis of those days, which was the war with Mexico and the reality of slavery and the call for abolition. He entitled his poem, "The Present Crisis." Excuse me. And I believe in the chat, you may be able to find a link to the full poem. He called us to reckon in his poem for the sake of our souls with those shadows. He called us to that as a part of his spiritual practice in this precious, wonderful life for the nation where he lived then and we reside now. His words were so inspiring, they were amended and put into music in 1896. If I haven't said it, James Russell Lowell was a Unitarian. Those hymn words went on to appear in many Protestant hymnals. As Unitarian Universalists, we further amended those words to reflect our ongoing revelation about widening the doorway to our truth and our faith. What began as his exact poetic words, "once to every man and nation," has been amended in our current hymnal, number 119, to once every soul and nation. Olga will play the hymn through one time, since I understand your congregation is not familiar with it. And then we will join her in singing, though please remember to stay muted as she leads us in this. Thank you, Olga. In my home congregation in New Bedford, Massachusetts, we sang that song at least once a year. This is the time we take with each other to open our hearts and hold all these joys, sorrows, and concerns in our hearts, singing together, draw the circle wide. When the worship team met this week and we talked about what we needed, one of the words that came up among us was comfort. So let us join together in the spirit of prayer and the hope for comfort with these words of prayer from Ted Loder. Well, God, I made it through another sweet, sour time. And here we are, nibbled, frazzled, puzzled, awed, and in need of what? A chuckle, maybe? A revolution begun with a belly laugh, a Bronx cheer in the face of the onslaughts of disaster and death itself. Such is our need, and such is our wonder. Could you, God, really be as humorless, as grimly serious as we have sometimes made you out to be? Or do aardvarks and monkeys, bullfrogs and platypuses, puppies and porpoises and people perhaps reveal the comic side of your love? Tickle us into giggling down the wailing walls of our endless grievances and trip up our waddling pomposities. Lord of laughter as of tears, shake us awake, teach us to laugh at ourselves, at our black draped solemnity over our petty preoccupations with success and failure, through all the hurt and adversity, until our laughter lures us deep beneath the terrors without names, beneath the questions without answers, beneath the pain without relief. Lure us deep to the love in us unused, to the strength unspent, to the courage untapped, to the dream unrisked, to the beauty unexpressed, all the way down to the inescapable bottom, to the awareness that we must get on with being who we are as fully as each of us can, as unflinchingly as we can, as accurately as we can, which is to say, as gracefully, as powerfully, and as faithfully as we were created to be. Amen. Tommy Dorsey, who lived from 1899 to 1993, a long life, is known as the father of gospel music. And the tune we're about to sing, Precious Lord, he wrote the tune and the lyrics as he was in the hands of grief after the death of his wife. We sing it today in acknowledgement of the many losses we have suffered in the last 10 months. We remember all those who died because they could not obtain enough health care or personal protective equipment, or live too long with poverty and substandard health care in this rich nation. Let us remember those who have died because their skin color or their style of dress or their need to flee violence, perhaps most especially sexual violence in their homelands, brought them to their death. Let us open our hearts to those children who, separated from family by death or border patrols, are frightened and scared. Let us remember all of those and ourselves who face the multiple losses that have come upon this pandemic world in the last year, from the loss of normality to the more enduring losses of finances and well-being. Let us join Olga in singing as we mute and she leads, precious Lord.
Lord. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When my way grows drear, precious Lord, linger near. When my life is almost gone, through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When the darkness appears and the night draws near, and the day is lost and gone, and the river I stand, guide my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home.
Thank you, Olga. When I first thought of this sermon, or how it really works, I came up with the title. It was accompanied by this image in my mind of a doorway, probably of average height, but so long in width that you could not see either side. And walking through the doorway was humanity. All 7.8 billion of us, or the best I could do to imagine that. In that vision, I assumed we were walking toward that one truth. I wanted to extol the beauty of that one truth, remind us that if there is some capital T truth in the world, they endure because the doorway is wide enough to fit everyone and anyone who has and will ever live. That one of those truths is that we are held in the arms of a loving present that endures beyond any one religion, belief, and is woven through the universe. And I was reminded of a sign I used to have on my office door: God has no outcasts. And then I started to write, and I remembered that evil is also enduring. That anyone who wishes may walk through the doorway where only believers in us and them are welcomed. Perhaps I'd gotten it all wrong this week. What if there really isn't that single truth? There are branches that have separated and become shadows, and that in our lifetime will probably not find their way back to life. What if there isn't one truth? What if instead each of us is our own tree of wisdom, which I do believe? All of us have branches that have separated themselves within us from a wisdom of self. The work of spiritual being is to engage practices that help us see those branches of shadow, and then to choose again and again and again. As a congregation, you are also your own tree of wisdom. And you too have branches that have separated themselves within the whole, branches that operate from something other than the wisdom of our principles and purposes. The work of being congregation is to engage in practices that help us identify those branches of shadow, and then to choose again and again and again. But maybe the truth is this, the truth, capital T. There is a wisdom gathered over the millennium of human existence. Truths that build love and kindness and compassion and justice in the world. And there are shadows. And that is true. Maybe that is a one truth. It is also part of that truth that those shadows are revealed when we shine light on them. And we shine the light when we overcome our own fears, when we begin to identify within ourselves the voices of hate and start to counter them, when we bring warmth to our own coldness and own shadows, and then shine those kind words and truth spoken within out into the world. That is the hope of our liberal, meaning wide, religious tradition. May we be light. May we shine into the world as the truth is revealed to us slowly in pieces. We approach one shadow at a time, and that is courageous. Let us join together in singing as Olga leads us in our final hymn, This Little Light of Mine.
Let it shine, let it shine.
Thank you, Olga. We often mistake our certainties for enduring truths. So perhaps opening ourselves under the tree of wisdom is to allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to not be certain, but to seek the truth. So let us go forth once again with these words from Anne Hillman. We look with uncertainty beyond the old choices for clear-cut answers to a softer, more permeable aliveness, which is at every moment at the brink of death. For something new is being born in us if we but let it. We stand at a new doorway, awaiting that which comes, daring to be human creatures, vulnerable to the beauty of existence, learning to love. Amen. So may it be.